She met him where broken people go to rebuild their lives. He wrote her letters filled with gratitude and hope, called her his angel, the only person who believed he could change. She ignored her daughter's pleas, her sister's warnings, the quiet voice in her own mind screaming danger. Because at 57, after decades of loneliness, someone finally wanted her. Or so she thought. The night he showed up, drunk at her door, his gentle hands became fists, his loving words became threats. In that moment, Margaret Sullivan realized the truth. She hadn't saved him. She'd invited a predator into her life. And now, trapped in her own apartment with a man who'd been lying since the first letter, she had to make a choice. Believe his promises one more time, or fight for her life. The November rain hammered against the windows of Margaret Sullivan's apartment in Astoria, Queens, creating a steady rhythm that matched the loneliness in her chest. At 57, she had grown accustomed to the silence that filled her two-bedroom home, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. The television played reruns of old game shows, voices filling the space without really touching the emptiness inside. Margaret sat at her small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea that had long gone cold. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see the glow of neighboring apartments, families moving behind curtains, lives being lived while hers seemed perpetually on pause. She had retired from her administrative job at Mount Sinai Hospital 2 years earlier, after 33 years of answering phones, scheduling appointments, and organizing files. The gold watch they gave her sat in a drawer somewhere, a symbol of time served rather than celebrated. Her divorce from Robert had been finalized 8 years ago, though the marriage had truly ended long before that. 26 years of growing apart, of conversations that became shorter and silences that grew longer, until one day he simply announced he'd met someone else, someone younger. He didn't need to say. Margaret had signed the papers without fighting, too tired to argue for something that had stopped being real years before. Her daughter, Jennifer, had moved to Portland 5 years ago with her husband and 2 children. They FaceTimed occasionally, brief check-ins where Jennifer asked if she was eating well and taking her medications. Margaret always said yes, even when dinner was crackers and cheese, even when she forgot her blood pressure pills for days at a time. She didn't want to be a burden. She'd raised Jennifer to be independent, and now that independence meant 3,000 miles and completely different lives. The rain intensified, and Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The apartment felt colder than usual, though the radiator clanked and hissed with effort. She thought about calling her sister Linda, but Linda was always busy with her book club or her grandchildren or her volunteer work at the community center. Linda's life was full in a way that made Margaret's feel even emptier by comparison. It was a Tuesday evening in early November when everything changed, though Margaret didn't know it yet. She was scrolling mindlessly through Facebook, looking at pictures of people she barely remembered from high school, when she saw a post from her former colleague Ruth. Ruth had started volunteering at a rehabilitation center in the Bronx, working with people in recovery from addiction. The post showed Ruth smiling alongside several residents, all of them holding certificates of completion for a life skills workshop. Something about the image struck Margaret. These were people who had hit bottom and were climbing back up, people who had lost everything and were fighting to rebuild. There was hope in their faces, determination. It reminded her of something she'd forgotten, that change was possible, that life could surprise you, that maybe her own story wasn't finished yet. On impulse, Margaret clicked through to the Rehabilitation Center's website, Serenity Path Recovery Center, located in Hunts Point. They were looking for volunteers to help with various programs, literacy tutoring, job readiness coaching, basic computer skills. Margaret had spent 3 decades organizing and helping people navigate complex hospital systems. Maybe she had something to offer. The next morning, she called the volunteer coordinator, a woman named Patricia, who sounded genuinely thrilled to hear from her. "We desperately need people with your experience," Patricia said. "So many of our residents are trying to re-enter the workforce, and they need guidance on everything from writing resumes to understanding workplace expectations. Could you come in for an orientation next Tuesday?" Margaret agreed, and for the first time in months, she felt a flutter of anticipation. She had somewhere to be, something to do, a reason to shower and dress and leave the apartment. The week passed slowly, but when Tuesday arrived, she took the Q70 bus to the subway, then the 6 train up to Hunts Point, watching the neighborhoods change through the scratched windows. Serenity Path occupied a renovated brick building that had once been a factory. Inside, it was surprisingly bright and clean, with motivational posters on the walls and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the common area. Patricia met her in the lobby, a warm black woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. The orientation covered the basics: confidentiality, boundaries, safety protocols. Margaret learned that Serenity Path was a long-term residential program housing up to 60 men and women at various stages of recovery. Residents typically stayed for 6 to 12 months, working through treatment while learning skills to rebuild their lives. Volunteers were essential to the program, providing the individual attention and mentorship that the small staff couldn't always offer. After the orientation, Patricia gave her a tour. They walked through the dining hall, the computer lab, the library, and the classrooms. Residents nodded politely as they passed. Some engaged in group therapy sessions, others working on assignments. Margaret noticed the careful structure of it all. The schedules posted on every wall, the sign-in sheets, the supervised activities. These were people learning to build routine and stability, often for the first time in years. "We'll start you in the job readiness program," Patricia said as they returned to the administrative office. "Every Thursday evening, 6 to 8. We have a group of about 15 residents who are within 3 months of completing the program. They need help with resumes, interview skills, understanding workplace culture. Think you can handle that?" Margaret nodded, feeling both nervous and excited. "I can handle that." Her first session was the following Thursday. She arrived early, her heart pounding as she set up the classroom. She'd printed out sample resumes and interview questions, prepared a short presentation on professional communication. When the residents began filing in, she was struck by how ordinary they looked. She didn't know what she'd expected, maybe the hollow-eyed addicts from television dramas, but these were just people, young and old, black and white and Latino, men and women, all of them carrying stories she couldn't see. And then he walked in. His name was Marcus Chen, and he was the last to arrive, slipping into a seat in the back row. He was in his early 50s, Margaret guessed, with thick black hair going gray at the temples and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything. He wore a simple gray sweater and jeans, and when he caught her looking, he offered a small apologetic smile that made her glance away quickly. The session went well. Margaret talked about the basics of resume writing, and the residents listened attentively, asking questions and taking notes. When she opened the floor for practice interviews, Marcus volunteered first. He stood at the front of the room with an easy confidence that surprised her, answering her questions about his work history with thoughtful, articulate responses. "I worked in restaurant management for 15 years, he said, his voice smooth and measured. "I understand teamwork, customer service, high-pressure environments. I made mistakes that cost me everything, but I've used my time here to understand those mistakes and make sure I never repeat them. There was something compelling about the way he spoke, honest, without being self-pitying, confident without being arrogant. When he returned to his seat, several other residents looked at him with respect. After the session ended, Marcus approached her desk as she was packing up her materials. "Thank you for what you're doing here," he said. "A lot of us forgot what it's like to have someone believe we're worth investing in." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm just sharing what I know. That's more than most people are willing to do." He paused, then extended his hand. "I'm Marcus Chen." "Margaret Sullivan," she said, shaking his hand. His grip was warm and firm. "I hope we'll see you next week, Margaret Sullivan." "You will." As she rode the subway home that evening, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, of being seen, of mattering. She told herself it was about the volunteer work, about helping people rebuild their lives. She didn't let herself acknowledge the small thrill she'd felt when Marcus smiled at her, or the way his voice had stayed in her head long after the session ended. It was just volunteering, just helping people. Nothing more than that. Over the following weeks, Margaret's Thursday evenings became the highlight of her routine. She prepared diligently for each session, creating handouts and exercises that would genuinely help the residents succeed. The group responded enthusiastically, showing up on time and engaging seriously with the material. She learned their names and their stories. Carlos, who wanted to become an electrician; Denise, who dreamed of opening a bakery; Raymond, who just wanted to provide for his daughter again; and Marcus, who attended every session and always stayed a few minutes after to help her clean up. Their conversations started casually. He would stack chairs while she gathered papers, and they would talk about the session, about what had worked and what could be improved. But gradually, the conversations deepened. Marcus told her about his life before addiction, growing up in Flushing, Queens, the son of Taiwanese immigrants who ran a small grocery store, how he'd worked his way up from dishwasher to manager at a successful Manhattan restaurant, how he'd started drinking to cope with the stress, then drinking to cope with everything, until the alcohol became his whole world. "I lost my wife, my career, my home," he said one evening as they walked to the subway together. The December cold bit at their faces, but Margaret didn't mind. "Everything I thought defined me, gone, but maybe that was necessary. Maybe I needed to lose everything to understand what actually matters." Margaret found herself opening up in return, sharing things she rarely talked about: the loneliness of her marriage's final years, the emptiness of retirement, the way she sometimes felt invisible, like the world had decided she no longer had anything to contribute. "You're not invisible," Marcus said quietly. "Not to me. Not to anyone in that classroom." The words settled in her chest, warm and unexpected. When was the last time someone had truly seen her? When was the last time anyone had looked at her with genuine interest rather than polite obligation? By mid-December, Serenity Path was preparing for the holidays. The facility would remain open, but volunteers were taking breaks to spend time with family. Margaret mentioned that Jennifer had invited her to Portland for Christmas, an invitation she knew was offered more from duty than desire. "Are you going?" Marcus asked. "I don't think so," Margaret said. "The flight is expensive, and I don't want to impose on their family time." What she didn't say was that she dreaded the visit, the careful conversations, Jennifer's worried looks, the unspoken assessment of whether Mom was coping okay on her own, the way she always felt like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be enjoyed. "I'll be here for Christmas," Marcus said. "Most of us will be. We have a dinner, some of the volunteers come. It's actually pretty nice." Margaret surprised herself by saying, Maybe I'll volunteer that day. She did. On Christmas Day, she took the subway to the Bronx and spent the afternoon at Serenity Path, helping serve turkey and stuffing to 60 residents who had nowhere else to go. Patricia had decorated the dining hall with paper snowflakes and twinkling lights, and someone had set up a speaker playing classic holiday songs. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and genuine in a way Margaret's Christmases hadn't been in years. Marcus found her after dinner, as residents were clearing tables and laughing over board games. "Want to see something?" he asked. She followed him upstairs to the library, a quiet room lined with donated books. Through the window they could see the Manhattan skyline, all those distant towers glittering with lights. From this distance the city looked magical, full of promise. "I sit here sometimes," Marcus said. "Reminds me that there's a whole world out there waiting. I get another chance at it." They stood in comfortable silence, and then Marcus said, "I've been meaning to tell you something." Margaret's heart quickened. "I'm completing the program next month," he continued. "I'll be transitioning to the alumni phase, living in a supervised apartment, working part-time, continuing therapy. It's the next step." "That's wonderful," Margaret said, meaning it. "You've worked so hard." "I have missed talking to you, but I'm going to miss our Thursday sessions." The thing neither of them had acknowledged directly. The connection that had grown beyond volunteer and resident, beyond teacher and student. Margaret knew she should maintain boundaries, should keep this professional. But standing there in the dim library, with the city lights spread below them, and Marcus looking at her with such open warmth, she didn't want to be professional. She wanted to be seen, to be wanted. "I'll miss talking to you matter to someone," she said quietly. Marcus smiled, and for a moment Margaret let herself imagine a different kind of future, one where she wasn't alone, where someone looked forward to seeing her, where she had something to look forward to beyond empty evenings and silent meals. Patricia's voice floated up from downstairs, calling for volunteers to help with cleanup. The moment passed, and they returned to the dining hall. But something had shifted. As Margaret rode the subway home that night, she felt nervous and alive in a way she hadn't felt in decades. In January, Marcus moved into the alumni housing, a supervised apartment building in Mott Haven where program graduates could live while transitioning back to independence. He got a job washing dishes at a diner in Manhattan, taking the subway at 5 in the morning to make the breakfast shift. He attended mandatory therapy sessions and checked in with his case manager twice a week. He also started writing letters to Margaret. The first one arrived in mid-January, her name and address written in careful handwriting on a white envelope with a Serenity Path return address. Inside, Marcus thanked her for her help and encouragement, for seeing potential in him when he'd struggled to see it in himself. It was respectful and warm, nothing inappropriate. Margaret wrote back, congratulating him on his progress and asking how the new job was going. She told herself it was just maintaining a professional relationship, supporting someone's recovery. But the letters continued, arriving weekly, and they began to go deeper. Marcus wrote about his struggles with temptation, about walking past bars and having to force himself to keep going, about the loneliness of sobriety, how he was learning to sit with uncomfortable feelings instead of drowning them, about his hopes for the future, maybe managing a restaurant again someday, maybe reconciling with his ex-wife and daughter, maybe just proving that he could be the man he should have been all along. Margaret found herself responding with equal honesty. She wrote about her own loneliness, about the way retirement had left her feeling purposeless, about Jennifer's polite distance, about Robert's betrayal, about the terrifying possibility that this was all there was, just waiting quietly until she died. "You're not just waiting," Marcus wrote back. "You're one of the strongest people I've met. Look at what you've done for me, for all of us in that program. You matter more than you know." The letters became the center of Margaret's week. She would wait by the mailbox, heart racing when she spotted that familiar handwriting. She started writing back immediately, sometimes drafting and redrafting her responses to get the tone exactly right. Her sister Linda noticed the change. "You seem happier," she said, during one of their monthly lunches at the diner near Linda's house in Bay Ridge. "Something happened?" "I'm volunteering," Margaret said, which was true. "Helping people at a rehabilitation center. It's fulfilling." Volunteering doesn't usually make someone check their phone every 5 minutes. Margaret blushed, caught. She'd been hoping for a text from Marcus, who had recently gotten a basic cell phone as part of his transition plan. "There's someone," Linda said, not asking. "It's not like that," Margaret protested. We're friends. He's in recovery, and I'm helping him stay on track." "Uh-huh." Linda's expression was skeptical. "Just be careful, Maggie. People in those situations, they're vulnerable. Sometimes they latch on to whoever's helping them, and it's not real. It's just need." The words stung because they echoed Margaret's own secret fears. Was Marcus's attention real, or was she just a convenient source of validation? Was she fooling herself? But then her phone buzzed with a text. "Thinking of you today. Hope you're well. M." And the doubt evaporated. This felt like
real.
someone actually caring about her, not out of obligation, but because he chose to, because she mattered to him. By late February, they had progressed to daily texts and occasional phone calls. Marcus's voice would fill her apartment in the evenings, talking about his day at the diner, about the challenges of staying sober, about how much her support meant to him. Margaret found herself living for these conversations, for the way Marcus listened to her thoughts and opinions like they had value. "I want to see you," he said one evening during a call. "Not just at Serenity Path events. Really see you. Is that allowed?" Margaret's breath caught. She knew the rules. Volunteers were discouraged from personal relationships with current or recent program participants. But Marcus was in the alumni phase now, living independently, working, managing his own life. Wasn't that different? "Where would we go?" she asked, not saying no. "Anywhere you want. Coffee? Dinner? Just a walk in the park?" They met the following Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop in Astoria near Margaret's apartment. When she saw Marcus waiting outside, dressed in clean jeans and a button-down shirt, her heart jumped. He smiled when he saw her, and suddenly all her fears, that she was too old, too ordinary, too desperate, they talked for 3 hours, losing track of time entirely. The conversation flowed easily, jumping from childhood memories to favorite books to hopes for the future. Marcus was attentive and engaged, asking questions about her life with genuine curiosity. He made her laugh with stories about disastrous restaurant shifts. He made her feel interesting, desirable, alive. When they finally left the coffee shop, Marcus walked her to her building. At the entrance,
"Can I see you
he
again?"
took her hand gently.
"Yes?"
Margaret said without hesitation. As she rode the elevator to her apartment, she caught sight of herself in the mirrored walls. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. She looked like a woman who had something to look forward to. She looked happy. Spring arrived gradually in New York, the brutal winter finally releasing its grip. Trees along the streets began to bud, and people emerged from their apartments with the tentative hope that comes with warmer weather. For Margaret, the changing season felt symbolic. Her life was blooming again, opening up in ways she had thought were no longer possible. She and Marcus saw each other twice a week now, always at her apartment or at quiet places around Astoria. He was attentive and affectionate, bringing her flowers from the bodega, texting her good morning and good night every day. When they were together, he focused entirely on her, asking about her day, her thoughts, her feelings. It had been so long since anyone had paid such careful attention to Margaret that she felt herself unfolding under his gaze like those spring flowers. But there were moments that gave her pause, small things that didn't quite fit. In mid-March, Margaret invited Marcos to her apartment for dinner. She'd spent the afternoon cooking chicken cacciatore, Robert's favorite, though she tried not to think about that. Marcus arrived with a bottle of sparkling cider. "Practicing for when I can celebrate with the real thing," he joked, though something in his tone felt off. During dinner, Margaret's phone rang. It was Jennifer calling from Portland. Margaret excused herself and took the call in her bedroom, spending 15 minutes talking about her grandson's soccer game and her granddaughter's piano recital. When she returned to the living room, Marcus's expression had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something cold and watchful. "Must be nice," he said, his voice tight. "Having family who cares enough to call." "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ignore you." "No, it's fine. I'm just the recovering addict you're helping out of charity. Family comes first, right?" The sudden shift startled Margaret. "Marcus, that's not... Jennifer's my daughter. Of course I'm going to talk to her." He was quiet for a long moment. Then his face softened. "You're right. That was unfair. I'm sorry. I got jealous. You're the only person who makes me feel like I matter. And sharing you, even for 15 minutes. He shook his head. "I'm working on my insecurity in therapy. I shouldn't have taken it out on you." His apology seemed genuine, and Margaret felt guilty for her annoyance. Of course Marcus felt insecure. He'd lost everything and was rebuilding from scratch. A little jealousy was understandable, even flattering in its way. But the incident stayed with her, a small knot of discomfort she couldn't quite shake. A few weeks later, Linda invited Margaret to lunch. They met at their usual diner in Bay Ridge, sliding into their regular booth. Linda wasted no time getting to the point. "I want to meet him," she announced. "This Marcus you've been seeing, bring him to Sunday dinner at my place." Margaret's stomach tightened. "I don't think he's ready for that." "Why not? You've been seeing him for what, 3 months now?" "If this is serious, I want to meet the man who's got my sister acting like a teenager." "It's complicated, Linda. He's been through a lot, which is exactly why I want to meet him." Linda's expression was firm. "Maggie, I love you, but you have to admit your judgment hasn't always been the best with men. Robert fooled you for years. I just want to make sure this guy is treating you right." The criticism stung, even though Margaret knew Linda meant well. "Marcus isn't Robert. He's honest about his struggles. He's working hard to build a better life. Then he should be able to handle meeting your sister." Linda reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "Please, for my peace of mind." Margaret reluctantly agreed, though she dreaded telling Marcus. When she brought it up during their next phone call, his reaction confirmed her fears. "Your sister wants to interrogate me, you mean?" he said, his voice sharp. "See if the ex-addict is good enough for her precious sister." "It's not like that. Linda just wants to meet you. It's normal. Normal for people who haven't had their entire lives judged and dismissed by everyone around them. Normal for people who don't have to prove they're human beings worth knowing." His breathing was heavy on the line. "Is this what you want? To subject me to that?" "Marcus, because I'll do it. If that's what you need to prove I'm serious about you, I'll do it. I'll sit there and let your sister pick me apart. Let her find all the ways I don't measure up. I'll do anything for you, Margaret. Don't you know that by now?" The conversation left Margaret shaken. She called Linda back and canceled the dinner invitation, making excuses about Marcus's work schedule. Linda's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "Just be careful," Linda said finally. "That's all I'm asking." But Margaret didn't want to be careful. Being careful had gotten her through 26 years of a dead marriage and 2 years of lonely retirement. Marcus made her feel reckless and desired and young again. Why should she apologize for that? In April, Marcus completed 6 months in the alumni program. He was doing well, his case manager reported, maintaining his job, attending therapy, staying sober. The next phase would give him even more independence, allowing him to move into his own apartment outside the Serenity Path system. "I'm thinking about getting a place in Astoria," Marcus mentioned casually one evening as they walked along the waterfront. "Close to you, if that's okay." Margaret's heart soared. "Really? I want to build a life here, with you, if you'll have me." He stopped and turned to face her, taking both her hands. "Margaret, I know this has moved fast. I know my situation isn't ideal. But you saved my life. You gave me a reason to believe I could be better. I don't want to lose that." "You won't," Margaret said, and meant it. "You won't lose me." They kissed there on the waterfront, with the Manhattan skyline glowing across the water. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks and wasn't sure if they were hers or his. Marcus found a studio apartment 3 blocks from Margaret's building, a cramped but clean space on the 4th floor of a walk-up. Margaret helped him move in, which didn't take long since he owned almost nothing. Some donated clothes, a few books, basic kitchen items from the thrift store. They spent the afternoon making the space livable, hanging curtains and organizing the small closet. "It's not much," Marcus said, looking around the sparse room. "It's yours," Margaret said. "That's what matters." He pulled her close, and they made love for the first time in his new bed, a mattress on the floor with borrowed sheets. It was tender and urgent, and afterward, lying in Marcus's arms, Margaret felt a contentment she hadn't known was possible. This was what she'd been missing, not just sex, but intimacy, being chosen, being wanted. She ignored the small voice in her head that whispered about the program rules she'd broken, about Linda's concerns, about the age difference, about how quickly this was all moving. She was 57 years old. She'd spent long enough being cautious and responsible. She deserved this happiness. But the warning signs kept appearing, subtle at first, then harder to ignore. Marcus quit his job at the diner in early May. "The manager was a complete asshole," he explained when Margaret expressed concern. "Treating me like I was stupid, giving me the worst shifts, passing me over for the prep cook position, even though I'm way more qualified. I don't need that negativity in my recovery." "But you need income," Margaret said carefully. My case manager doesn't understand what it's like to work for someone who disrespects you every day. I'll find something else, something better." But weeks passed, and Marcus didn't find another job. He stopped attending his mandatory therapy sessions, claiming his therapist was stuck on old trauma instead of focusing on the future. When Margaret gently suggested he needed to follow his program requirements, he accused her of not believing in him. "I thought you were different," he said, his eyes wounded. "I thought you understood that I'm not just my addiction, that I'm capable of making my own decisions, but you're just like everyone else waiting for me to fail." "That's not true." "Then trust me, please. Can you just trust me?" Margaret backed off, hating the hurt in his voice. Of course she trusted him. She loved him, though they hadn't said those words yet. She knew it was true. She loved him, and love meant believing in someone even when things got difficult. He started spending more time at her apartment, often showing up without calling first. Margaret would come home from grocery shopping to find him waiting in the hallway, or he'd knock on her door at 10 at night, saying he couldn't sleep and needed to see her. At first it felt romantic, this urgency of his need for her, but gradually it began to feel suffocating. When she mentioned maybe needing some evenings to herself, to catch up on reading, to call Jennifer, to just have quiet time, Marcus's face crumpled. "You're tired of me," he said. "I knew this would happen. I knew you'd realize I'm not worth your time." "That's not what I said. Do you have any idea what it's like? Going from seeing you, feeling human and valued, to being alone in that shitty apartment with nothing but my thoughts? Do you know how many times I've walked past bars, Margaret? How close I've come to just saying fuck it and throwing away everything I've worked for?" The implication was clear. She was all that stood between Marcus and relapse. How could she prioritize her own comfort over his sobriety, over his life? So she didn't. She made herself available whenever he needed her, swallowing her growing exhaustion. She was helping someone she loved. That was what mattered. In June, Jennifer called with news. She was coming to New York for a work conference in July and wanted to visit. "I haven't seen you since Christmas," she said. "I miss you, Mom. Can I stay with you for a few days?" Margaret was thrilled and terrified. Jennifer would meet Marcus. Jennifer would have questions. Jennifer would see all the things Margaret had been trying not to see. When she told Marcus about the visit, his reaction was worse than she'd feared. "So your daughter's coming to inspect me," he said flatly, "to decide if I'm good enough for Mommy." "It's not like that. She just wants to visit." "Bullshit. She's going to take one look at me and tell you I'm using you, that I'm just another fuck-up who's going to break your heart. And you're going to believe her because she's your daughter, and I'm just... What am I, Margaret? What am I to you, really?" "You're the man I love," Margaret said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Marcus went very still. "What did you say?" "I love you. I do." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I love you too," he whispered against her hair. "God, I love you so much. You're everything to me. Everything." It should have felt triumphant, this declaration. Instead, Margaret felt a creeping sense of dread she couldn't name. The warning signs were there. She just refused to see them. Jennifer's visit in mid-July was tense from the moment she arrived. Margaret picked her up from LaGuardia, and on the drive back to Astoria, Jennifer talked about her job, her kids, her life in Portland. Safe topics that required minimal response, but Margaret could feel the unasked questions hovering between them. At the apartment, Jennifer settled her bag in the guest room and emerged looking around with barely concealed concern. "The place looks good, Mom. You're keeping it nice." "Of course I am," Margaret said, defensive without meaning to be. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. You sounded different on the phone lately. Distracted." Jennifer paused. "Is everything okay?" Margaret was saved from answering by a knock at the door. She knew who it was before she opened it. Marcus stood in the hallway holding a bouquet of bodega flowers, wearing his best button-down shirt and an anxious smile. "I know I said I'd wait until tomorrow," he said, "but I couldn't. I needed to see you." Jennifer appeared behind Margaret, and Marcus's expression shifted to something carefully neutral. "You must be Jennifer," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Marcus. It's wonderful to finally meet you." Jennifer shook his hand but didn't return the smile. "Mom's mentioned you." The evening was excruciating. Marcus was on his best behavior, charming and attentive, asking Jennifer about her
Jennifer
work
responded
and her
with
children. Polite coldness, her answers clipped and her body language closed off. Margaret found herself caught between them, trying to smooth over the awkwardness, to make Jennifer see what she saw in Marcus. After Marcus finally left, kissing Margaret goodbye and whispering, "I love you," loud enough for Jennifer to hear. Mother and daughter sat in heavy silence. "How long?" Jennifer asked finally. "And you met him at the rehab center where you volunteer?" "Yes." Jennifer let out a long breath. Mom, please tell me you see the problem here." "He's in recovery. He's doing well." "He showed up uninvited when he knew I was visiting. That's not normal, Mom. That's controlling. He was nervous about meeting you. He wanted to make a good impression. By ignoring your boundaries." Jennifer's voice rose. "You told him to come tomorrow. He came tonight anyway. That's a red flag." Margaret felt anger kindle in her chest. "You don't know him. You don't know what he's been through, how hard he's worked. I know he's an addict who latched onto a vulnerable woman who was lonely. I know that's textbook manipulation. How dare you? Mom, I'm worried about you." Jennifer's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You're different. You're jumpy and defensive, and you barely mentioned him until I pushed. What are you hiding?" "I'm not hiding anything. I'm in a relationship with someone who loves me, who makes me feel valued and alive. I'm sorry if that's inconvenient for you." "Inconvenient? Mom, I'm scared for you." They argued for another hour, getting nowhere. Jennifer laid out her concerns. Marcus's lack of employment, his dependence on Margaret, the way he'd rushed the relationship. Margaret defended him fiercely, hearing herself make excuses she half believed. He was struggling to find the right job. He needed support during a vulnerable time. She had been lonely too. Hadn't she rushed into this just as much? But lying in bed that night, unable to sleep, Margaret let herself acknowledge what she'd been avoiding. Things with Marcus had changed. The sweet, grateful man from the early letters had been replaced by someone needier, more volatile, more controlling. He called her constantly, showed up without warning, sulked when she had He'd stopped plans. Working, stopped attending therapy, stopped following any of the structure that had helped him stay sober. And she was exhausted, constantly managing his emotions, reassuring him, proving her love. When had this stopped being a relationship and become a rescue operation? Jennifer left 2 days later, the visit cut short by mutual discomfort. At the airport, she hugged Margaret tightly. "Please be careful," she whispered. "Please, I can't lose you too." Margaret promised she would, even as she resented the implication that she needed protecting. The situation deteriorated rapidly after Jennifer's visit. Marcus seemed to sense Margaret's growing doubts and responded by intensifying his demands on her attention. He wanted to know where she was every moment, who she was talking to, what she was doing. He went through her phone one night while she was sleeping, then confronted her about a text from Linda. "Planning lunch with your sister without telling me?" he said, waving her phone. "What else are you keeping secret?" "You went through my phone?" Margaret was stunned. "Marcus, that's a violation." "A violation? I'm trying to have an honest relationship, and you're sneaking around behind my back." "Lunch with my sister isn't sneaking around. She hates me. She's trying to turn you against me, and you're letting her." They fought for hours, Marcus alternating between rage and tears, accusing Margaret of betrayal while begging her not to abandon him. She felt like she was drowning, unable to find solid ground. By the time he finally left her apartment at 2 a.m, she was shaking with exhaustion. The next day, she called his case manager at Serenity Path, breaking the confidence she knew she shouldn't break. "I'm worried about Marcus Chen," she told Patricia. "I think he's struggling more than he's admitting." Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "Ms. Sullivan, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but Marcus was discharged from our alumni program 3 weeks ago for non-compliance. He stopped attending required meetings, stopped checking in, stopped following his treatment plan. We tried to reach out, but he blocked all contact. Margaret felt the floor drop out from under her. He told me he was doing well, that his case manager said he was thriving. He doesn't have a case manager anymore. He refused continued services. After she hung up, Margaret sat in her apartment, staring at nothing. Marcos had lied about his status in the program, about his therapy, probably about his sobriety. How much of what he'd told her was true? How much of their relationship was built on deception? She knew she needed to end it. But the thought of being alone again, of returning to those empty evenings and silent meals, was almost as terrifying as staying. That night, Marcus let himself into her apartment with the spare key she'd given him months ago. She was sitting at the kitchen table, and when she looked up, something in her expression must have given her away. "You called Serenity Path," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Marcos, after everything I told you
went
about
behind
needing
my
you
back
to trust
and
me,
called them.
you betrayed me. You've been lying to me for months. I protected you from details you didn't need to worry about. I was managing my recovery my own way, by not going to therapy, by not following any of your treatment plan." His face twisted with rage. "You have no idea what it's like, sitting in those meetings, being treated like a child, having every choice questioned
I was
and suffocating. And you're the only person who made me feel like I was more than my addiction. But I guess I was wrong about you. You're just like everyone else, waiting for me to fail, looking for reasons to give up on me. That's not fair." "Fair? You want to talk about fair?" His voice rose to a shout. "I gave you everything. My trust, my love, my whole fucking heart. And this is how you repay me? By checking up on me like I'm some kind
Margaret
of
stood,
criminal?" Her own anger finally matching his. "Get out." "What?" "Get out of my apartment. Give me back the key and leave." For a moment, Marcus looked genuinely shocked. Then his expression hardened into something ugly. "Fine, fine, but don't come crawling back to me when you're alone again, when you remember that nobody else is ever going to want a dried-up old woman like you. I was doing you a favor, Margaret, and you just threw it away." He slammed the door so hard
Margaret
the
stood
walls
in
shook.
the
Silence, her whole body trembling. She thought she'd feel relieved. Instead, she felt terrified, because 3 days later, Marcus came back. And this time, the man who knocked on her door wasn't trying to charm her. He was trying to destroy her. The knocking started at 11 at night, so loud and insistent that Margaret's neighbor across the hall opened his door to complain. Through the peephole, she could see Marcus, his face flushed with rage or alcohol or both. She knew she shouldn't open the door. Every instinct screamed at her to call the police. But a terrible part of her still hoped this could be fixed, that the Marcus she'd fallen in love with was still in there somewhere, just temporarily lost. So she opened the door. He pushed past her into the apartment, and she smelled liquor on his breath. "We need to talk," he said, stumbling slightly. "You're drunk. So what? You drove me to it. You and your judgments and your phone calls to Serenity Path. You destroyed everything we had. Marcus, you need to leave." "I'm not going anywhere." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "You don't get to throw me away like I'm nothing. You don't get to decide you're done with me." Fear spiked through Margaret, sharp and cold. This wasn't the man she knew. This was someone dangerous. "Let go of me." "Or what? You'll call your bitch daughter?" "Your perfect sister, who never made a mistake in her life." His grip tightened. "You're pathetic, you know that? A lonely old woman so desperate for attention, she fell for the first man who showed her any interest. Did you really think this was about love? I needed a place to stay, someone to support me while I figured out my next move. You were just convenient. The words were designed to hurt, and they did. But beneath the pain, something else was rising. Margaret thought of all the times she'd excused his behavior, all the boundaries she'd let him violate, all the warning signs she'd ignored. She thought of Jennifer's worried face, Linda's concern, her own instincts screaming at her to run. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Get out now, or I'm calling 911. Marcus laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "You won't. You're too scared of being alone again." But Margaret was already reaching for her phone, and they struggled briefly. He was stronger, but desperation made her fierce. She managed to hit the emergency call button before he wrenched the phone away and threw it against the wall, where it shattered. "You stupid bitch," he snarled and raised his hand. Margaret closed her eyes, waiting for the blow. Instead, she heard a male voice shouting, "NYPD, step away from her." Her neighbor across the hall, Mr. Rodriguez, had called the police when he heard the commotion. 2 officers were at her door, hands on their weapons, ordering Marcus to get down on the ground. Everything happened very fast after that. Marcus was handcuffed and removed from her apartment, still shouting threats and accusations. One of the officers, a young woman with kind eyes, stayed with Margaret, asking if she was hurt, if she needed medical attention. Margaret found she couldn't stop shaking. "This is my fault," she kept saying. "I let this happen." "No," the officer said firmly. "This is his fault. You didn't do anything wrong except try to help someone who took advantage of your kindness." Mr. Rodriguez brought her a glass of water and sat with her while she gave her statement. When the officers finally left, he made her promise to get the locks changed and to call her family. Margaret nodded, too numb to do anything but agree. She called Jennifer at 3 in the morning, New York time, midnight in Portland. Her daughter answered on the second ring, instantly alert. "Mom, what's wrong?" And Margaret told her everything. The lies, the manipulation, the drinking, the violence. She confessed how foolish she'd been, how desperate for love she'd ignored every red flag. She expected judgment, anger. "I told you so." Instead, Jennifer said, "I'm booking the next flight. Don't argue. I'm coming." Jennifer arrived the next afternoon, took one look at her mother's exhausted, bruised face, and pulled her into a fierce hug. "We're going to get through together," she said. The following days were a blur. Jennifer helped Margaret file a restraining order against Marcos. They changed the locks, and Jennifer insisted on installing a chain and a deadbolt as well. They went to the police station to follow up on the assault charges. Margaret learned that Marcus had been arrested for violating his parole. The drinking, the assault, both constituted violations that would send him back into the system. "He can't hurt you anymore," Jennifer said. "He's going away for a while." But the damage wasn't just physical. Margaret found herself jumping at every sound, terrified every time someone knocked on her door. She had nightmares about Marcus breaking in, about his hands around her throat. She couldn't believe how close she'd come to losing everything: her safety, her life, her dignity. "I was so stupid," she told Jennifer one night as they sat in the living room, the television playing softly. "I saw exactly what he was doing, and I let it happen anyway." "You weren't stupid. You were lonely and vulnerable, and he exploited that. That's not your fault. I ignored everyone who tried to warn me. You, Linda, my own instincts. I chose him over all of you." Jennifer took her hand. "And now you're choosing yourself. That's what matters." Linda came to visit the next week, and Margaret braced for recriminations. Instead, her sister hugged her and said, "I'm so glad you're okay. That's all that matters." The 3 of them, Margaret, Jennifer, and Linda, spent the weekend together, talking and crying and beginning the slow process of healing. Jennifer had to return to Portland eventually, but she made Margaret promise to call every day, to go to therapy, to rebuild her support system. "You're not alone," Jennifer said at the airport. "You were never alone. We're here. We've always been here." After Jennifer left, Margaret did go to therapy. Patel, a gentlewoman in her 60s, specialized in domestic violence and trauma. She helped Margaret understand that what had happened wasn't a failure of judgment, but a calculated campaign of manipulation by someone who'd learned to identify and exploit vulnerable people. "Abusers are often charming at first," Dr. Patel explained. "They have to be to get past your defenses. They find your weaknesses, loneliness, desire for connection, need to feel valued, and they use those against you. None of this was your fault." It took time for Margaret to believe that, but slowly, session by session, she began to forgive herself. She began to see that she'd been strong, not weak, that recognizing the danger and ending the relationship had taken courage, that surviving had taken strength. She also began to rebuild her life in healthier ways. She reconnected with old friends from the hospital, women she'd lost touch with after retirement. She joined a book club at the local library. She started taking a watercolor class at the community center, discovering a talent for painting she'd never known she had. And she stayed in closer contact with Jennifer and Linda, letting them in instead of pretending everything was fine. When she felt lonely, she called them. When she had a bad day, she texted. She learned that asking for help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. 6 months after that terrible night, Margaret stood in her apartment looking at a watercolor she'd just finished, a view of the Manhattan skyline from the waterfront, the buildings glowing with light against a darkening sky. It was the view she'd seen with Marcus that Christmas night. But she'd reclaimed it as her own. This was her city, her life, her future. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "Thinking of you today, Mom. Love you." Margaret smiled and texted back, "Love you too. I'm doing well. Really well." And it was true. She was healing. The scars were still there. The bruises on her arm had faded, but the ones on her heart would take longer. She still jumped at sudden sounds sometimes. She still had nightmares occasionally. But she also had moments of peace, of joy, of genuine contentment. She'd learned that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely, that her worth wasn't determined by whether someone loved her, that she was enough all by herself. A week later, Patricia from Serenity Path called. "I wanted to check on you," she said, "and to apologize. We should have warned you more clearly about maintaining boundaries with residents." "You did warn me," Margaret said. "I just didn't listen. How are you doing?" Margaret thought about it. "I'm surviving, and someday soon I'll be thriving again." She meant it. She'd lost a lot. Her trust, her sense of safety, but she'd gained something of her life too. A clearer understanding of her own strength, her own value, her own resilience. She was 58 years old, and her story wasn't over. It was just beginning anew. And this time, she would write it on her own terms. On a crisp October morning, Margaret took the subway to the Bronx one last time. Not to Serenity Path, but to the courthouse where Marcus was being sentenced for assault and parole violation. She didn't have to attend, but Dr. Patel had suggested it might bring closure. She sat in the back of the courtroom and watched as Marcus, wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, was led to stand before the judge. He looked older, smaller, diminished. He scanned the courtroom and his eyes landed on her. For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Regret, perhaps, or just calculation. Margaret would never know. The judge sentenced him to 18 months with mandatory treatment and supervision afterward. Marcus was led away without looking back. Margaret walked out of the courthouse into autumn sunshine. The leaves were turning gold and red, falling gently to the sidewalk. The air was crisp and clean, full of possibility. She pulled out her phone and called Linda. "Hey, want to grab lunch?" "Always," Linda said. "You okay?" Margaret took a deep breath of the October air. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, I really am." And walking down the courthouse steps toward the subway, toward lunch with her sister, toward the rest of her life, Margaret Sullivan believed it. She had survived. And survival, she was learning, was just another word for strength.